Running water is one of the most impactful forces on the surface of our planet. It flows ever downward on its journey toward the sea, forming rivers and streams that are the lifeblood of the landscapes we live on. With ever-changing flows that can be both beautifully serene and humblingly powerful, they carve their way across continents in winding networks that can be seen from orbit. This scale is matched by the sheer volume of nutrients and sediments that they move and deposit, shaping landforms and creating vast swaths of terrestrial rocks across the globe. Life also thrives in and around rivers, and when organisms die, the burial of their remains in river sediments leaves an astonishing record of floodplain ecosystems through time. But in order to interpret this information, researchers have to understand the processes by which living organisms can be preserved after death for us to find today. My name is Michael Chiappone, and I am one of a new generation of interdisciplinary researchers seeking to unravel the mysteries of how the fossil record forms. Using experiments replicating flood conditions at full scale and evidence from the fossil record, we will explore the factors that can cause bones to be transported and buried when floodwaters are unleashed upon the landscape. Through the study of death, we will bring the past back to life. We live in a time of astounding biodiversity. Even with an ever-expanding level of human development, we share this planet with an innumerable variety of fascinating organisms all intertwined in a complex web of interaction. Looking back into Earth's history, one can imagine that diversity pales in comparison to the vast sea of our forebears. The fossil record, our window into the history of life, reflects this in the evolution of seemingly endless forms most beautiful through time. And yet, despite the Earth leaving us this amazing record of our own history, we know that less than 1% of everything that has ever lived has become fossilized. This gap between the true diversity of ancient life and what we can recover in the fossil record begs the question of what allows an organism to become a fossil. This was a question that inspired Russian paleontologist Ivan Yefremov during his PhD in 1940. Many other paleontologists of the time uncritically applied fossil data to evolutionary and ecological questions without taking into account how fossils came to be in the first place. Seeing this, Yefremov proposed a new field of study within paleontology. He called it Taphonomy, the study of the laws of burial. Taphonomists concern themselves with everything that happens to an organism after death that might influence fossilization. And while one might imagine carcasses and skeletons as static features on a landscape, this actually couldn't be less true. Bones are tossed around by scavengers, dried out and weathered in the sun, and chemically altered over time. Most of these factors lead toward their destruction, acting as a series of filters that stop the vast majority of organisms from ever having a chance at fossilization. In some environments, potential fossils have better chances of survival than others, and one of the best environments to preserve fossil bones on land are rivers. Sedimentary rocks laid down by the action of rivers and their floodplains make up around half of the places where fossil bone beds have been found, meaning that they are of particular interest to paleontologists. Why are rivers so important in preserving vertebrate fossils? Well, for one thing, river basins cover vast tracts of land that are inhabited by a wide variety of organisms. It's in these living systems that sediment can be transported over vast distances, with rivers worldwide transporting over 13 trillion tons of sediment into the oceans every year. Where sediment is moving, bones have a comparatively good shot at being buried, making fluvial systems uniquely positioned to be long-term storage sinks for organic material. Any paleontologist who works on terrestrial rocks knows how plentiful vertebrate fossils can be in river and floodplain deposits. And as the field of taphonomy has evolved, some researchers have tried to pick apart how bones end up deposited in these rocks. In 1969, Dr. Michael Voorhees was among the first to try to do this using physical experiments. By placing sheep and coyote bones into moving water, he sorted different bone types into categories based on how easily they moved. These Voorhees groups have been used by paleontologists for over 50 years to look at how bones are sorted by river water before they're buried. Finding certain bones more often than others at a fossil site can tell you whether they were exposed to river flow, which is important to investigating whether animals at your site were buried near the place they died, or if they were moved some distance by water flow. Ideally, paleontologists want to find as much of an animal's skeleton as possible to tell them about how they lived. But fossils can be buried in all kinds of flows, and rivers are far from static. Yearly changes in flow rates due to water input from rain and melting ice can lead to much more dramatic flows that contribute to the fossil record. Flooding. There are many different types of floods, and evidence for nearly all of them can be found in the geologic record. When rivers overflow their banks, skeletons that are laying out on the landscape have the chance to be caught in the flood and potentially be buried in sediment. These flows are different from steady rivers in that their speeds and water depths change and evolve over the course of a flood, meaning anything caught in the flow might experience different conditions over short time periods. And while more typical river flows have been experimentally tested by researchers like Voorhees, floods have rarely ever been examined. But how do you create an intentional and controlled flood to run bone transport experiments with?
Welcome to St. Anthony Falls Laboratory in Minneapolis, one of the premier places in the world for studying fluid dynamics since 1936. St. Anthony Falls Lab, or SAFL for short, is known for its use of flumes to study a variety of questions related to engineering, geology, ecology, and much more.
Flumes are like scaled-down artificial river channels, through which water flow can be precisely controlled. SAFL has flumes of all shapes and sizes, and perhaps the most impressive is the main channel. Nearly 3 meters wide and 80 meters long, the main channel pulls water from the Mississippi River outside straight through the building. Being so large, the main channel was the perfect setting for our experiments, allowing the bones plenty of room to disperse from their starting points, just like in a real sheet flood. With an experimental landscape ready to be tested in, what we needed now were bones. Investigating how bones move in water flow is mainly a question of physics. The shapes, sizes, and weights of the bones can all influence how they might move, and while modern bones are an obvious go-to for testing, we also wanted to know how bones with different shapes in the fossil record might move in comparison. So in addition to loaning a sheep skeleton from the Science Museum of Minnesota to experiment with, we also created models of the skeleton of a juvenile hadrosaur, or duck-billed dinosaur, at a similar size to the sheep. After printing and weighting the bone models to densities appropriate for real modern bones, it was time for the experiments to begin. We placed the bone models in intervals along the center of the channel and prepared to quickly open and close the upstream gate, which would create a sheet flood. As the water rushed into the building, we observed how different bones began to move as the flood overtook them, causing them to tumble, roll, and drag downstream. We measured how far the bones went and repeated our tests over and over again. And it didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Some results matched previous experiments and typical steady river flow very closely. Larger, denser bones tended not to move as far as lighter ones. and bones of different shapes clearly moved in different ways, just as Voorhees and other researchers had shown. But these new flow conditions also yielded some other interesting results. While we were able to statistically place our hadrosaur bone models into loose transport groups, our sheep bones were not so easily categorized. Not only that, but the groups we were able to statistically derive for the hadrosaur still showed a significant amount of overlap between the groups. On real-world landscapes, and thus at fossil sites, this means we might expect bones to sort more continuously based on their sizes, shapes, and densities, instead of into clear categories, especially during the chaotic conditions of flooding. When elongated bones were exposed to water flow, we saw that they would often reorient themselves to be parallel with the flow as they moved. From a physics perspective, a parallel orientation reduces the surface area exposed to flow, which in turn reduces drag. This means that once the bones reoriented, they often would stop moving altogether and become stable. Other external factors could also cause bones not to move as far as they otherwise might. The formation of ripples and dunes in the floods added topography on which the bones could become stuck. Sometimes, bones would become caught on one another, causing them to stop and create bone jams, as is often seen at bone beds in the fossil record. When a bone wasn't moving, sediment would often continue to move around it, digging a hole underneath it and creating an eddy on the downstream side. This phenomenon, called scouring, is what happens when you stand in the shallows at a beach, when water is drawn away from the shore. Through scour action, bones could become anchored and even partially buried, reducing their ability to move further. These factors all had impacts on how far bones were likely to move. When we ran multiple consecutive floods, bones that were reoriented parallel to flow, caught up on obstacles, or showed sediment scouring, all tended to move less and less each time they were exposed to water flow. And in real-world floods, these factors would be heightened, with obstacles like vegetation presenting even more of a barrier to movement. Because of this, bones found at fossil sites that formed in flooding outside of river channels may not typically have moved many kilometers away from where the animals died, so long as the floods in question don't appear to have been extremely large and violent, based on the geology present at the site. Instead, another factor that may come into play is not whether organisms were moved out of the habitats they actually lived in, but whether they were moved far enough that they were less likely to be buried at all. The fans of sediment left by levee breaches, called crevasse splays, and other overbank flood events often decrease in thickness moving away from the river channel that caused them. This means that if bones that are caught in the flood are transported to the edge of the crevasse splay, less sediment is deposited that might allow them to be buried than closer to the levee break, meaning that they're less likely to enter the fossil record for us to find. This bias would preferentially select bones that are either more difficult to transport, or at least began their journey closer to the levee breach, where sedimentation rates are much higher. Additionally, sorting of bones based on their size, shape, and density also appears to be very important on local scales within a fossil site. Most fossil quarries can't be excavated over extremely wide areas for practical reasons, meaning that if an animal's skeleton is spread out over a sufficiently large area, we might be preferentially missing bones that are easily moved by water flow and could be waiting just outside the bounds of our dig sites. Documenting this spatial aspect of fossil data is a standard part of paleontological fieldwork, and the resulting quarry maps contain critical spatial data that can then be used for taphonomic analysis based on experimental data, like ours.
And that's to help us figure out where, once we get everything back to the museum and prepped out, where each bone came from in relation to each other. In some quarries, it helps us figure out, okay, if we've got multiple individuals, this bone might go to one individual, this goes to another. Here, it's helping us tell the story about how these bones might have been transported. Because one thing you'll notice on this side, in this pit, we have mostly smaller bones and ribs. Over in the other pit, we've got much bigger bones. So, you know, that could be telling us something about the flow that buried these bones in the end.
These are all processes that paleontologists have to take into account, both to guide our excavations to maximize the amount of fossil material we recover, and also when conducting research to recognize the biases that underlie the data that we use to understand ancient ecosystems. More than that, though, taphonomy is how we reconstruct the stories that are told by fossil sites themselves. The processes that act to break down or to preserve organic material have been happening for as long as organisms have lived and died. And most of these phenomena are directly observable and testable in the modern day. And because rivers and the floods that occur when they overflow their banks are so deeply entwined with the terrestrial fossil record overall, understanding how flows can move, sort, and bury bones allows us to make better interpretations of where the terrestrial fossil record comes from. It's at this confluence of fluid dynamics, organic processes, and geology where a kind of language emerges. A wordless history written by every sediment grain that tells of days when the humbling force of water unleashed captured a snapshot of an ecosystem that could then be preserved for countless millennia. And in learning to speak this language through the interplay of experiments and observations in the field, our knowledge of the history of the natural world and our own place in that unfathomably vast story grows.
Crime won't help you, crime won't do you no good. Crime won't help you, crime won't do you no good. 'Cause when the levee breaks, honey, you gotta move. Well, last night I sat on the levee